Ой, блин.
2 hours later.
Наконец я так дошел до этого. Блин, сколько мне еще проходить эту игру?
2 часа спустя.
Я еле дошел.
You are about to see the most incredible.
Фух, наконец-то что-то было прикольно. Если ходилки будут так.
Later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early The next morning, one shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later. 72 hours later, 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moment, graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later. 80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3 soon after. Later. Moments later.